11,000.
Recording in progress.
Swenson's hawk, 100,000 of the Swensons. Ruby-throated hummingbirds, 5. White pelicans, 250. So they're having a great time. They've been out there for 11 days. They'll be back shortly. Did everybody hear me okay? Oh, here's the gang. We got a picture of the gang out there. Whoop.
Wait for it.
It's coming. There they are. So that's Nancy, and well, I guess the first person is Cindy Hamilton. Then there's Nancy, Sue Motel, Bill Williams, and Shirley Devan. Dave Yoker's not pictured there, but he's with them plus some other people. So it sounds like they're having a great time. All right, I guess I can go ahead and
Let me
introduce.
stop this. Okay.
Okay. Well, we're really excited tonight to have Dr. Shawn with us. He is often considered a classic natural historian with a broad love of nature for birds to bees and everything in between, believing the best way to learn from nature is to experience it. He is an associate professor within the Department of Biological Sciences at Hampton University. He is noted for the passion he brings to the classroom, exciting students about natural world and involving them in his research. His educational background includes the University of Delaware, LSU, and the University of Texas at El Paso, where he's earned degrees in entomology, wildlife conservation, and pathology. His research has focused on systematics and ecology of ants with publications on their biodiversity and ecology. Dr. Dash has recently focused on unraveling themes of insect biodiversity in urban and suburban landscapes, exploring the insect diversity around Hampton Roads. He's sought after a public speaker to many regional nature focus groups. He was just here in Williamsburg last night with the Historic Rivers chapter doing presentations there. So he's back up in Williamsburg again tonight. He gives information-packed seminars, guest lectures, training sessions, and guided field trips. He's a broadly trained naturalist and can be found speaking on topics from beach ecology to pollinators, bird identification, and of course, insects, particularly ants. Dr. Dash loves the opportunity to bring others on the adventure of understanding the natural world. Serving as Hampton Roads Bird Club president, he is able to live out such dreams while on the pursuit of our feathered friends. So I'm excited to welcome Dr. Dash. Please join me.
Again, thank you for the invitation.
Mhm.
I'm always happy to come up
Here's some
to,
water. for you.
oh, great, outstanding,
Mhm.
to Williamsburg.
Rick, do you know how to bring that up?
Yeah.
I mean, Dr.
Okay.
Dash knows.
I'll just let you do that so I don't.
I want to see your pretty face first. There you are.
Okay. So it's that time of year, and I know there's some things going on with my magical fonts, but what that really says is the natural history of Halloween. So I stole from slides that I had from a presentation on nighttime birding, especially with owls, because owls are kind of cool. But I figured, you know what, it's almost Halloween. I like Halloween. You should like Halloween. So I thought we would just get a little bit of the evening tickling fancy related to Halloween themes in nature. So there's 2 major things that we'll talk about for the next 5 minutes or so. And that's just a celebration of Halloween-esque colors and also a little bit about Halloween biology. Noting there's a cute little vampire bat that's down below. Now, I gave this talk last night to the Historic Rivers chapter, but I skewed it to mostly about insects because I was giving a training about insects. So we talked about some nasty things like botflies and their relatives. And so first, this doesn't say Halloween, I don't know what bird might ring in Halloween. A bird that's so colorful with yellows and oranges and blacks and purples, but never to forget what that bird actually does. So that creepy idea of feeding on carrion being exemplified by this king vulture, which one day, hopefully I get to southern Mexico to see, because it's closer than other places. Now, you might have all seen these wonderful assassin bugs in your garden. They're kind of dead now. There's 2 waves of them. There's a springtime and a fall time, but they look Halloween-y to me too, orange, black, and yellow, running around drinking the blood of nearby insects. So that vampiric theme with Halloween being exemplified in this beautiful bug. And then one of my favorites of all insects, one, the common name for that caterpillar. Does anyone know the common name that also has a Halloween-y scary sound to it? It's called a hickory horn devil. And it's the largest caterpillar in North America. It can get about 8 inches long. They're highly parasitized. So they like to feed on hickories and walnuts. That's where the moth gets its common name, the royal walnut moth. And interestingly, a fun fact for you to share with your friends, families, or a complete stranger is as that caterpillar chews on leaves, those leaves release compounds. So just like you smell a flower, it has compounds that are aromatic that move throughout the currents. As it gets chewed, those compounds waft in the air and they are picked up by parasitic wasps that know something's chewing on a tree. Then they go and lay an egg inside of that young caterpillar. Now, there might be another wasp that comes and lays an egg as well, and eventually those eggs hatch as little maggots that are eating that caterpillar from the inside out. Oftentimes releasing chemicals themselves that keep the caterpillar growing, so there's more room for them to grow, and eventually they will pupate. And you might have not seen this with a hickory horn devil, but everyone's seen the images of a tobacco hornworm, either firsthand or that's not the word I was looking for. Catalpa is the word I was looking for. Tree, because there's really common worms around here, caterpillars. They get parasitized, the white cocoons pop up. So again, Halloween colored, kind of Halloween theme with the devil. Also, it gives me a chance, because I like to talk about those things, about parasitism, and that parasites are really good about taking over the brain of their host. And so some birds that we'll talk about this evening, some jays have this problem in the tropics because there's a little nematode worm that sits on a branch. And as an ant crawls by, it crawls up into the ant, goes into the gut, develops in the ant. And then when it's mature, it needs another bird host to complete its life cycle. So it makes the ant's butt turn red, where it climbs high on a tree, sticking its butt out to look like a berry. And the birds pick up the ants as they forage for berries. Now that nematode can crawl out of that ant, complete its life cycle in the bird poops it out, the little worm crawls, and then can complete its life cycle again. So that zombie kind of theme of taking over the bird and ant. And then one of my favorite birds, again, look at those Halloween colors, but again, that creepy coloration and theme is with these hooded putahoos that are poisonous. There's very few examples of poisonous birds. Those that are poisonous kind of all use the same mechanism, which is they sequester things that they eat. So in the Bible and in the Middle East today, there's still some concerns with quails that are poisonous because they eat the berries. They sequester the compounds from the berries. So if you eat the quail, you get those toxins, just like a monarch keeping the toxins from the milkweed, passing them on. So these birds eat little beetles, and those little beetles are getting nasty compounds from plants. So the beetles get it from the plant, the bird get it from those beetles. And this was discovered one of those serendipitous ways where they were banding these birds that occur in Papua New Guinea and throughout Indonesia. And the banner, the scientist, wiped his hands after working with the bird, and his whole face swelled up. And so there's nice images of him where he looks normal holding a bird, and then afterward looking outside because his mouth and face is all swollen from the toxins that are found in that bird. And then interestingly, those toxins on the same group as the toxins that poison arrow frogs have. So a highly potent neurotoxin that indigenous peoples in South America use to take down prey. But from those frogs, they're doing the same thing. The frogs eat ants and beetles that take the compounds from the plants. So an interesting bit of natural history there. All right, so when we're wandering around in the darkness, as we get closer to Halloween or we're walking to our car, I wanted to give us some other fun facts to think about. In particular, eye shine. Now, being good people that we are, naturalists at heart, I want you to identify all the animals based upon their eye shine. Yeah. And can we do that? Well, if you know a little bit of a cheat, it's not that hard. So if you look at white-tailed deer, they have white eyes. Screech owls, they have red eyes, and that screech owl is up here, the third one. Then we also have cats and possums and coyotes. And this is a very interesting morphological feature that we find in eyes of some, but not all, nocturnal animals. And we see it being useful in identifying them, but also as a cadre or assemblage of adaptations for nightlife. And I think about that being a birder. I love birding, but I also like the night. I have a really rough time waking up early. It's always been the bane of me birding is getting up at 3 in the morning to bird. I got to get dressed. I need to eat. Then I have to realize I didn't shower, so I better go shower. So Virginia doesn't smell me stinking on the field trip. So all these things happen to me. And then eventually I get out there. And this was true, especially when I lived out west, living in Arizona, going to Arizona, wanting to get up early so I could bird before the day got hot. So for a while, I was like, I'm just going to bird at nighttime. One, there's very few nocturnal birds. So my life list is going to be tiny. Plus, it's really hard to find birds at night. I have a whole bunch of owls I've never seen. Some I've heard, but I've never seen. So bird during the day, it's easier. But if you're really interested in those birds at night, they have some pretty cool adaptations. So again, creepy themes, the big eyes of the oil bird that allows it to see in the dark, but oil birds, as well as some swifts, have echolocation, so they can detect where they're flying about. This is of a great horned owl that's been plucked. I know that image isn't always the nicest image to see, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how big an owl's eyes are to its skull. And related to us talking about corvids, one of the big things that we see in some of those groups, like crows, they actually have quite large eyes for their skull size as well, taking in a lot of visual information, processing that information and understanding their environment. And of course, we talk about owls seeing, but we all know that they do a lot of their business by hearing. And look at the hole, the ear hole on that little saw-whet owl. So these little tiny owls have massive ear holes, comparable to eyes, even though they're way tinier, to pick up the slightest whispers of a mouse crawling through the vegetation. The tympana lucidum is that reflective part of the eye that gives you the eye shine. Depending upon how the rods and cones are assembled, you get different colors. And so just some cool fun facts. Where would we be without talking about bats and those fun facts? Using echolocation. Bats have left our area mostly. They're hibernating now, but they're pretty cool because they use that echolocation. And then I would be remiss to not talk about moths who've evolved ears to hear the bats to avoid predation. And sometimes those moths click back and jam the echolocation of a bat. So the bat clicks. As it gets closer, the clicks get faster, it knows it's close, but then they start to click erratically back and the bat gets all confused. And then some moths actually, and I won't do it here, I did it last night, scream, and they have a loud pulse that goes back out to disorient the bat. Now, bats have parasites too. Look at that fascinating creature. Look how cool and creepy that looks. I put one under everyone's seat, so hopefully you get to take this home. This is a bat fly. It lives on the bat. It drinks the blood from the bat. It never leaves the bat. It no longer has wings. As you can see, none of it has wings. And it's a nice little sucking creature living on those bats, which is a kind of cool, creepy looking thing. I think it looks really like a monster, so you got that. But of course, another image of Halloween is that of ravens and crows. So what I would like to do is try to talk this evening about the corvids of the United States. And noting, so don't judge me too harshly, I lost this entire presentation this afternoon, like at 2:30. And so I've reconstructed it the best I could with help from my students. For extra credit, they put some things together. Now they plagiarized, they didn't cite that they used all about birds. So I would be a bad professor if I didn't point out by default, I also plagiarized because they did. So what are the corvids? It's not too terribly diverse of a group, but it's one that I think everyone talks about, including non-birders. It has some pest problems, especially when crows start to gather up in these communal roosts around airports, especially rural airports seem to have a problem with crows. Of course, agriculturally, there's some problems with crows that we'll talk about in just a moment. But there's this fairly large sized bird. I think I have it with the Canada jay being the smallest corvid in the United States. There are some smaller ones in Asia. And then the common raven, which is the largest, which is on par with the white-necked raven for size. So this big, massive bird. Last weekend, was it last weekend? Doesn't matter in the story. I took my students out to Mountain Lake. So I teach this biodiversity course, and we were learning trees in the car, which is hard. If you've never tried to identify trees at 75 miles an hour, it's a good challenge, but everything's changing pretty colors. So yeah, those in red are easy to pick out. You know, oh, that yellow tree with the white bark, oh, that's a sycamore. But we were also birding at the same time, being very distracted and stopping by Rockfish Gap so we could have lunch on the Blue Ridge Parkway, but I wanted to see raptors. And just for the students to get this idea of all these birds that migrate through. And I said, oh, I heard a raven. Watch out for a raven. So every little crow we saw, that's a raven. No, that's a crow. And then eventually up at the Raven's Roost picnic area on Blue Ridge Parkway, a big raven flew down to the picnic table and they're like, look at that huge bird, it's giant. And I'm like, that's a raven. So you think they are big, but they are actually, as we all know, quite large and impressive birds. One of the cool things with them is that they have very well-developed bills and it can manipulate. One of my favorite things watching them manipulate the environment, from a crow to a raven to a jay. And they manipulate because of their intelligence. So what I did salvage was a lot about bird intelligence this evening. And we're going to talk about how pretty they are, from green jays, which I think are the most beautiful bird in the world, especially of the corvids. My wife's car nickname is Green Jay. We have Green Jay paintings in the house. When my son was about to be born, I wanted to call him Green Jay. That got vetoed. So then it was Coyote for a while. I'm like, Coyote's a really good name. He's not either one of those now, but those were what I was going for. So I thought we might be getting sleepy by this point. Oh, he's talking about Halloween and insects. So let's make sure we can name all of the common corvids you might come in contact with as you travel around the United States. This probably being the easiest. So all at once, this is a blue jay, a green jay, that is a magpie. Which one? There's two. What's the other species of magpie?
European.
That's true. There's a European, which is also related to this one. So there's black-billed magpie. This one has a black bill. If you've noticed, I've had yellow-billed magpies up on my header because I really like magpies too. Do some pretty awesome things. So look how tiny that bill is. You're using, it is poofy, and Clarks and these live in a similar environment. They tend to be docile, although kind of tricky sometimes, stealing food from campers, especially up in the boreal forest of Canada. So that is a Canada jay, or gray jay, which they used to be called. So this one's the one tricky one that I threw in, but there's some established populations of this bird in San Diego. They're mostly in southern Mexico throughout Central America. And this is the black-throated magpie jay. I love that beautiful crest. It's a big bird, a big tail, a showy bird, a loud bird, just like all the other corvids. But it's just something so majestic about it. And knowing it's in San Diego and there's a chance for me to see it, besides going to Mexico, it's a fun thing to look for. Name that. Yep, so we have a raven. So you're looking for those nice bristles that extend along that nose pretty far, and also the rounded tail. We're almost done. We've almost got all of these. I can finish this evening early. We can all go get ice cream. So it's an allied of the scrub jays, but this is a Mexican jay, which Mexican jays, there's some pretty cool natural history about them as well. This was in Big Bend. A lot of birds keep trying to steal my food. It allows for really good photos, but they keep coming to my picnic table to take my food. So if we look at what birds are here in the United States, as it relates to corvids, we see that the majority of them happen to be jays, in particular, the scrub jays. And with recent molecular work, what used to be like the Western scrub jay has been divided into a few distinct species. Then, of course, one of the ones that we were looking for was Clark's nutcracker, one of my favorite birds too. I told you I really like this group. 2 crows now, because of the synonymy of the Northwestern crow with the American crow, 2 magpies, and then 2 ravens. So interestingly, not that much diversity, but if you ask anyone to name some birds, I would wager most of the birds they name would happen to be corvids. They'll talk about blue jays, they'll talk about crows, maybe mention a raven. And in part of the reason for this is that they're so adaptable. And there's a lot of research that's been going on looking at how adaptable they are, especially in terms of crows, in some part jays, that we are actually urbanizing crows to live really well in urban environments. And then there was a study done in Scandinavia where crows were listening to highways and they can sense the Doppler effect of cars coming close or far. So they know how long they have, and they can detect the as it gets closer to know that's when I need to fly away. Another study that was done in Europe was crows using roadways as an anvil to crack things like walnuts, either dropping them kind of gall style or lining them up so cars would run over the nuts and then they can get to the nut food inside, that meat. And then, of course, if we think about corvids, we wouldn't be nowhere if we didn't talk about culture. The famous, most of which is going to be the raven. Of course, that beautiful painting by Van Gogh with the, I think it's called The Crows in the Cornfield or something simplistic, but very beautiful. We also have our deep history tied to corvids. So this is Alexander the Great, and he died rather abruptly. So some pathologists came along and were trying to figure out why he might die. They proposed a reason. So it could have been assassination. It could have been just happenstance poisoning. It could have been some kind of other illness. Some suggested things like STIs. But what this group noted in the historic texts of Plutarch is that there was a whole bunch of ravens that died at Alexander the Great's feet. And given that that was occurring in Babylon in the Middle East, they thought that it could be West Nile virus. And some of those recorded observations of how those birds were acting matched the observations of crows and ravens in the United States when they were first exposed to West Nile virus. And so it's using modern science to try to describe what's happening in historic times, which I thought is kind of a cool thing. And then, of course, where will we be culturally, especially around the holidays? By holidays, I mean Halloween, without scarecrows. And along with scarecrows, so besides human effigies, we oftentimes have bird effigies. And so you might have witnessed, depending where you're from, I witnessed this when I was out in Kansas, that they hang dead crows from fence posts or shrubbery. Now, typically they were decoys, not actually dead crows. But the thought is, and it's based in science, that when birds see another bird in distress, like a crow, they avoid that area. And so they see these dead crows, they're going to avoid that area. The problem is, just like a scarecrow, corvids are smart, and they get habituated to the constant similarity, the constant non-moving, the constant influence of those scaring mechanisms. So one of the fun things that I was doing was trying to see if this decoy thing had a root in science. So I'm looking at all these, do decoys work for crows? What about scarecrows? And there's all these papers that people spent time trying to figure out what scares crows. So there's a funny paper that talked about putting like an axle on the arms of your scarecrow. And it had a little cute diagram, which I should have said, but making your scarecrow swing, so that would scare the birds. But also having owls that would have a dead crow, so a decoy owl with a dead crow that needed to flap every so often. So some kind of wind twirly whirl that would flap fake wings of the crow. And then my favorite are air cannons that oftentimes are used for waterfowl, especially at airports where you have these big gun blast sounding things to scare crows away from agricultural fields. But much more quicker than waterfowl, the birds kind of get used to those cannons. They habituate to that noise. So really talking about the adaptability of those. Now, some of us, when we're reading, might like to drink wine, or might just like to drink wine when we're not reading. And I really like to keep track of wine and animals. I think it's interesting how all these animals infiltrate alcohol, especially with microbrew beers, because they have like isopod ale and all these insect related things. But if you start to pay attention to that, corvids are one of the most common utilized advertisement or theme that come up on wine, which is just kind of cool. Although if you look at some of those pictures, they're not the right birds. Like that's not really a magpie in the upper middle image, but that's okay. Not everyone has a birder who's critiquing their designs. So I often end with a slide like this to give you all homework to do, but I thought I would put it in the beginning. So if you haven't read these books, you should. How many have read all these books? How many have read most of the books? How many can read? So the two easiest books to digest are The Mind of the Raven and Ravens in Winter by Bernard Heinrich. If you know me, you know I love his writing. He's very descriptive. He's very observant, breaks down a lot of science simplistically. And Bernard Heinrich was at University of Vermont, I think, and it was his student who eventually moved over to University of Washington, who did that famous study about faces and crows. Does anyone know that famous study where they wore a mask, they harassed the crows, and then they put the mask on different individuals, and the crows remembered who that person was because of the mask, which means from an intelligence standpoint, they're not just recognizing you're not a crow, but they can select different facial structures and recognize different individual people, which probably means they can also recognize different individual birds. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. This book, Crows and Ravens, is fantastic, but it's a big, thick book. I actually have it with me. It's very, very detailed, but it sets up the first 4 or 5 chapters about the intersection of humankind and corvids, which we'll mention a few more of those in just a moment. But it really talks about this deep-seated fascination with those birds and us. And then I gave you some children's books because now as a daddy, I think about kids and books. And there's a lot of bird books that have to do with ravens and crows. So a whole bunch of reading for you to do. Holidays are coming, so find someone who loves you to buy a book for you. Of course, we're in a library, so you can save all that and just get a book out. Now, some might argue that corvids are the most human-like birds, that of the birds we are going to talk about and describe human attributes to, I think the easiest is going to be the corvids. And because of this, they have infiltrated a lot of our culture for hundreds, if not millions of years. The classic sense is a lot of First Nations people have corvids at the center of their creation stories, oftentimes playing roles as tricksters to try to buff the normal status quo of how things should work, but also quoting their intelligence. We also see this with Aesop's fables and crows being utilized within those tales as well. And then if you are a nerd like me, you might be a fan of Marvel movies. So that's Odin from the Thor movies, but Odin in historic Norse mythology also utilizes ravens to carry out some interesting things like communication. And then I would be a bad biologist if I didn't talk about plagues. And so that classic plague doctor's face mask is thought to be that of a corvid. Of course, it's hollow, so you can stuff things into it so you don't smell the rotting stench of humans, which I always think is interesting. And if you list the things that they commonly use, it's always things like lavender and mirth. But then somewhere in that list, there's always like soaked rags and vinegar, which I would agree that would probably clog out the smell of death, but I would want something fruitier. That's just a bad selection in my mind. And I think part of the reason that we make these connections that are so tied to human history, so tied to human mythology, is that 1, they're intelligent, 2, they can talk. And oftentimes you can train, if you have a pet crow, that's not a good thing, but some people historically kept pet crows, they can mimic human voices similar to a parrot. And some of our corvids, like crows, some jays, have repertoires similar to that of some parrots. Not as diverse as the African gray parrot that has a huge repertoire of sounds. It can recognize particular words in that, but those ravens and crows also have words as well. So a certain squawk is for an aerial predator. Another squawk is for a snake. So you have this language, this culture that's building within a number of corvid species as well. They're big, so they're noticeable, they're adaptable. And then again, this deep-seated urbanization of crows where they've gotten used to us. They know when trash days are around, so they travel different streets to pick up the trash, collecting roadkill. Even if we look back at the times of impacting native cultures by hunting down the bison, there's thought to be range expansions of some of the jays and corvids that fed on those dead bison and moved further out from where they were historically. So let's talk about intelligence. And where does that intelligence come from? Because a lot of birds have this bad reputation. We use this colloquially about being bird-brained, being not too intelligent, not too clever, not too smart. But I think we need to put all that into what I call an ecological or evolutionary perspective. So I told you I was biased, as a green jay again, and thinking about all those things that have to influence that jay's life. How do you find food? How do you forage? How do you get along with other jays, same species or different species? How do you communicate? You have to communicate for a few different reasons. 1, for love. 2 for territoriality. Sometimes if we've been birding, some jays are pretty good at just warning other birds that there's a predator about. So why are you communicating out that way? Sometimes too, they're tricky, right? They make it sound like a hawk just to scare other birds up and about. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but I see that at my feeders sometimes, where the jays want to get in and there's a lot of woodpeckers or a lot of commotion. All of a sudden they do some hawk calls. Everyone flutters away and they fly down to my peanut tube or my platform feeder and pick up peanuts at their leisure. So again, this idea about being clever enough to doing some trick work. Thermoregulation, disease avoidance. And as I mentioned, West Nile virus really decimated the northeastern crow and jay populations for a number of years as it first invaded in the mid 1990s, I think. Offspring. So you'll note, and we'll talk about this again too, that many of these birds have invested time in parenting. And so if you look at how long birds spend parenting, some are really low. What would be an example of a bird that spends minimal time parenting? Cowbirds, great example. Just gonna lay my egg, you take care of it. Right, cuckoos, lay your egg, you take care of it. We also have brush turkeys. Has anyone heard of brush turkeys? They're an Australian species of bird. They do something similar to alligators and sea turtles, where they lay their eggs, but they pile up vegetation on top of the eggs, bury that vegetation, so it incubates the chicks, the eggs, and they hatch out and run about on their own. So no parental investment outside that nest building. But the lowest level is definitely cowbird, cuckoo. Here's an egg, I'm gone. But a number of jay species, especially in Europe, have extended periods of time where they keep feeding their young for maybe a year or two after they have fledged. And in that time, they're using this idea in behavioral ecology known as cultural transmission, which is just a fancy way of saying teaching. They purposely seek out teachable moments and make sure their offspring are learning. So you sometimes have seen this on the Discovery Channel with a killer whale. It's grabbed a seal from the beach. It takes that seal or sea lion out to sea, but then it lets the young work on it. Or you've seen it with a cheetah. It knocks down a Thompson's gazelle, but it doesn't dispatch the Thompson's gazelle. It lets its young try to practice hunting and killing that as well. So corvids are using their ability, extended parental time investment, to teach certain skills like foraging, learning timing, learning where the best resources are, especially if they're temporary resources. And then of course, you also see social interactions and problem solvings, which also help or at least are enhanced by the intelligence of these birds. But I want to give that context. So something to think about is this classic teasing apart when it comes to behavior, such as intelligence, of nature versus nurture. Are they clever because they just spontaneously learn to be clever? Or is there some deep-seated genetic basis or some physiological basis or anatomical basis for the things that you observe any creature doing, particularly birds? So this is just a diagram that tries to convey that there's a whole bunch of variation in any species. Some selected for, some selected against, where you can see lutristic crows. This one is called, does anyone know when you have this brownish crow, what it's called? They're called caramel crows, which I have a really hard time saying fast. Caramel crow, caramel crows. And with both of those, they're oftentimes found year after year after year. That is, typically other birds who don't match their colors that they should be for camouflage or for mating tend to get selected against by predators. They get picked off easier, but these birds are staying in part perhaps because of their intelligence. And so, as I mentioned, teasing that apart is oftentimes difficult. And what a lot of people have shifted to is not celebrating animals that we consider like us. That is, not celebrating primates, not celebrating dolphins, because intelligence isn't that unique. Because without intelligence, you don't have adaptability. Without intelligence, you don't have the ability to tease apart information. You don't have the survivorship. So there's a lot of behavior ecologists who poo-poo when we say crows are so intelligent. So you'll see these things come out with science people all the time. Like, yeah, that's part of how things work. Natural selection is selecting for behaviors for survivorship. But I still think it's cool that things are pretty clever. But why is that? Why are there some unique abilities that we see in some birds and not other birds? Why do we see problem solving in some birds and not other birds? And I bet we could all sit and name some birds that we know that have problem solving abilities, but it's not a huge list. Like somewhat limited to, I'm trying to think of some pigeons, some of the tits, of course the corvids, but we might not think about always sparrows having this ability to solve problems. Mental plasticity, how well the mind can deal with stress or novel situations. I already mentioned cultural transmission and this idea of adaptation to the novel. It's really good to have a repertoire that's consistent, but when new things come into play, it often stresses animals out and makes them really uncomfortable. And if you talk to my wife, I fall under that category. When something doesn't go and I think everything's fine, I get really upset. And sometimes, believe it or not, so everyone, I know it's being recorded, I am unreasonable when things don't go my way. Where if I go to a restaurant and I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna get a crab cake. And they come back and they're like, oh, we don't have any crab cakes. Then I'm not gonna have anything. I'm done. Don't want anything, which is completely, I see some people looking at their spouses. It's really unreasonable. I know it's unreasonable, but it's just, it throws off my normal routine. Or I get mean, like I went to, we won't mention the restaurant, Green Turtle, and they didn't have any Caesar salad. They're like, oh, we're out of lettuce. I'm like, there's Target across the street, go get some lettuce. Like it really made me angry, like viscerally angry, and it stresses me out. So adapting to novel situations is not something that's easily done by even intelligent animals, but especially for other animals, they can't change that behavior. So we might think about what makes corvids more intelligent than other birds. And this becomes this classic example of which came first, the crow or the egg. What really pushed intelligence? Were they inherently intelligent and therefore we see these unique behaviors? Or was it because of some certain factors that pushed, selected for, and reinforced intelligence? So one could be parenting. There's a lot of people who point out that the reason corvids are so intelligent is because they have extended parental investment, therefore bigger capacities to deal with all that information and care and things of that nature. You also might just talk about the brain structure. So animals that tend to be intelligent, classically, like primates, have a structure in their brain called the neocortex. It helps to sort all the information that's coming into your brain and parse it out to the correct response centers. Corvids don't have this. So they have compensatory morphologies of their brain that allow them to handle all that information and make judgments about it. You also have social structure, and not just pecking orders, but you have structure where there's dominant individuals. We also have these unique social systems in the Florida scrub jay, for example, that we'll talk about, and then food. And so there's a lot of historic scientists that use this food as a driver. I'm going to stick with food tonight because I'm hungry. And when I was reworking on my lecture, I was like, man, I wish I would have had lunch today. So food's going to be the driver because that's what was driving me. But no, there's some other ideas about things. Now, I mentioned things that we think might be stupid, like pigeons, actually aren't. Birds have more intelligence than we classically thought about, with pigeons being tested with different patterns in being able to differentiate around 700 or so different patterns and know their response. So these 2 black dots mean this, these 2 lines mean this. So they have this pattern recognition. Now that's a low-level thing to do, but it's still a complex thing to do considering bird brains are tiny. We often associate mental capacity with mental size. The bigger the brain, the more intelligent the animal is. If you read books about early human evolution, they often talk about the CCs, or the cubic centimeters of the brain of Lucy, or Australopithecus, Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and that our brains got bigger, therefore more things could be thought about, culture could develop, but it's really not necessarily the size of the brain, but the architecture, how those neurons interact with each other. And a classic example of bird brains debunking being stupid is an example we all know with New Caledonian crows, where they're able to make novel tools. Now, you'll find, if you don't know that many scientists are oftentimes cranky. So while a lot of them celebrate this idea of, oh, wow, this crow made a tool, there's other ones say, yeah, they made a tool because they have to make tools to survive. That's not a unique thing. All of a sudden, this bird made a tool. This species classically makes tools. And they're not the only corvid that uses tools, and they're not the only bird that uses tools. Can anyone think of another bird that uses a tool that's not a corvid? I'm giving you so many fun facts to amaze friends, family, or complete strangers with. So there's a little Galapagos finch that uses a stick to probe into wood to pull out grubs. So it doesn't have the same morphology as a woodpecker, but it's filling a similar niche, feeding on wood-boring insects, but it uses a stick to stick it in and then pull out those grubs. Okay, so one of the things I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with as we talk about behaviors, this idea of trial and error learning. If you talk to me, I will tell you that that isn't always inherent in people. And I have a son that demonstrates that. I also have some students that demonstrate that. They failed the test, they didn't study. They failed the second test, they didn't study. And my son will climb up on the couch, fall down and hurt himself, climb up on the couch, fall down and hurt himself, climb up on the couch, fall down and hurt himself. It is at a certain stage, at least with young children around 4 or 5, where that starts to click a lot easier. You don't need as many failures. And more importantly, you can watch others fail without having to repeat that action yourself. And this is a really big thing that occurs within a number of corvid species, is that they can learn from other birds' mistakes, such as a bird being hunted, a bird dying because of poison, a bird being in distress by someone grabbing it, squeezing it, letting that bird go. But now the whole flock knows, in the case of the mask, that person was not nice, but you didn't need to experience that unpleasant sensation to learn from it. The other big thing is reasoning. How do you have a problem and be able to put all the pieces of that problem together? And that's really what's celebrated a lot with the New Caledonian crows, is that they look for grubs that are in holes, and you have to select the right tool. Stick too big, won't go down. Stick too short, won't reach the grub. Sometimes you actually have to bend the stick. And that's what was in that last picture, is that they gave wire to those crows and they bent the wire to make a hook to lift up a little plastic bin in order to get the food that was inside that little puzzle. In fact, New Caledonian crows keep their favorite tools. They have a toolbox where they have their favorite big stick, their favorite little stick, maybe a medium-sized stick, that they know where it's at to solve particular problems as they investigate, tapping on the wood to determine how hollow it is as a proxy for how deep that hole might be. So that's insight. You're understanding the entire system. Now that relies on a really complex brain. And one of the ideas that we can look with that complexity of the brain, a common behavior across all corvids, is caching, the ability to store food. Now, I cache things all the time because my son likes to steal my snacks. I get some candy corn. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. Or I give a talk and they give me some cookies. I'm going to put them. And then I go and I'm like, hey, Katrina, which is my wife's name. Do you know what happened to those cookies the Master Gardeners gave? Oh, Henry ate them all. What? Hey, do you know where my candy corn are? Oh, Henry ate them all. So I'm trying to hide food around the house, but he's too clever for me. And then sometimes I forget. Hey, do you know where I hid? No. I put the Three Musketeers somewhere. Do you remember? No. And then the cleaners magically find it because then it's on my desk in my office that they've taken care of things. So the ability to hide and find is really important. Now we talk about squirrels hiding food and being able to find it, but their mental capacity is magnitude smaller than some things like Clark's Nutcracker that can keep track of individual seeds over extended periods of time. And part of what helps that architecturally in the brain is the hippocampus. And so if we look at corvid brains, they have a well-developed hippocampus, as do the parrots or the tits. So another group that's pretty intelligent, that if you read bird literature, you know about the blue tit and the great tit and these studies that were done in England and them learning when the milkmaid or the milkman was coming, and they could punch a little hole to get the fat off the top of the milk so they can learn from these varied environments. And so that need for food, especially because food is not consistent. One of the big drivers of behavior and of things in general is the unequal partitioning of resources. Not every place is a nesting place. Not everyone's going to have a mate. Not everyone's going to get a meal. And so because of limited resources, you start to see things like hoarding. You can do it as either scatter hoarding or larder hoarding, which are the two favorite types. And for birds, this is really important because unlike us, unlike bears, there's a constant balance between how much weight you can put on and still be able to fly. You can't maximize your calories. You can't store that as excess fat because then you're too fat to fly. And you might see this with birds like ravens, especially at a carcass where they've gorged themselves, or bald eagles, I've noticed this at a roadkill where they just eat and eat till they're really fat. And they're really labor trying to get up off the ground because they have all that food in them. Plus the digestive system's fast to push that all out. Birds, when they migrate, their testes shrivel up, so it's less weight. Birds don't have bladders because that's more weight, so they just get rid of it when they have to go. Even the singing centers of a bird's brain shrink during migration because they're not needed to optimize weight. So you have to hide your food. So you can do this in larder hoarding, which the classic example is acorn woodpeckers, which if you go out west, they're a wonderful bird, unless you have a log cabin where they drill holes and put all the acorns in, or the scatter hoarding, which we see in blue jays, as well as crows, where you take bits of food, either carrying or nuts, and hide them in the environment. Now, I told you, I really like Clark's Nutcracker, and I like them for two reasons. One, they're pretty intelligent. They can keep track of all the places they're putting those foods, but they also are ecosystem engineers. So last evening, I was trying to convince everyone that ants are ecosystem engineers because they turn more soil than earthworms. They plant wildflowers in the mountains of Appalachia. They eat more seeds in the deserts than rodents do. They're shaping the environment. They cut down leaves in the canopies of the rainforests. And then I asked the group, what are some other ecosystem engineers? So I ask everyone here, what are some ecosystem engineers that you can name, other animals that shape the ecosystems they live in? It's because you're all bird people and you don't love the other animals. They're feeling a little bit hurt. Beavers, making their dams, making their lodges, change the landscape. Elephants, knocking down woodland trees to open up savannas. But Clark's wolves in particular, and I think we've seen that where wolves been introduced to Yellowstone, start eating elk, now rivers and other ecosystems come back because of that. But Clark's nutcrackers have a really special relationship with white bark pine trees. And unlike other pines, their fruits are not winged. So if you've never looked at the structure of a pine seed, it looks like the samara of a maple. What's the non-botanical term for samaras? Twirly-whirly. So the maple trees that have the twirly-whirly, or green ash, if you have some green ash where they have the wing that allows for them to get dispersed. White bark pines don't have that. But there's observations out west on these desert buttes high above the tree line where you have white bark pine trees growing on top of it. And it's because the Clark's nutcracker takes the seeds and hides them around, doesn't remember where it hid every seed, but they germinate, and now you can get the tops of the buttes having these trees, having this forest because of the Clark's nutcracker. So again, this ecosystem engineer. Now that's kind of getting to this example of food driving intelligence. So one of the things that jays are, and I'm trying to give you some few examples of this, is that keeping your resources to yourself are important. And so there was a study that had jays that had lost their cache. So they hid their cache, another jay watched them, that jay went and stole their cache and re-hid it. And you see this probably like me with blue jays all the time. If they hide something nearby, I see another blue jay come and take it. Sometimes I have a group of like 4 crows that live in the yard that will then take it and hide it someplace else. For those birds who have been tricked by this and they notice another jay around, and this was done with scrub jays, is that they won't hide that food if there's other jays around. They'll either fly away or wait for that jay to leave. So they understand actions and reactions and understand motivation from other species. In this case, just getting enough food to survive. One of the other things that was interesting, and that might have been the next slide. Yeah, sorry, that was the next slide, but now you know the story. The other thing that's interesting is jays also have different caching sites. So if something is going to be easily decomposing, they select a different site than something that can go in long-term storage. So they have categories. Something I need to eat relatively soon, something I can wait to eat long-term. So I switched those slides in my mind, which I apologize. One of the big things that's difficult for birds is, and other animals, is recognizing yourself. Because if you can recognize yourself, you can recognize others. And we've seen this play out here with cardinals, where they get all excited, especially early in the season, when the males are all testosterone, they're really horny, they're trying to find love, and they attack any of their reflections. So self-recognition is not a common feature you see in many animals. And there's a simple test for it called the mark-mirror test, where you mark an animal and then you put it somewhere where it can't see the mark. So when it looks in the mirror, it still knows, oh, that's me with the mark. That scientist is doing something crazy again. Put a little hat on me, put an X on me, and recognize that's still me in the reflection opposed to someone else. And even when we think about dogs being fairly intelligent, they don't have that. And we might have experienced dogs trying to attack their reflection, not recognizing it's not them. But magpies, scrub jays, some crows, brown crows, for example, can recognize their reflections. Other things that we've managed to do that are elephants, some porpoises like dolphins, and primates. So a number of primates can. So one of the things that comes out of needing to find food, needing to store food, and knowing that others are competing with you for food is cooperation. And when we look at the scrub jays, they're a good example of cooperative work amongst the corvids. And so something that comes out of not just working together to store food, but working together to keep your baby safe and have enough resources. And where these birds, Florida scrub jays, for example, do an odd behavior where they give up their current mating potential. That is, instead of going off, finding their own mate and doing their own colony formation or their own family formation, they stay with their parents within a home range, helping to feed their younger brothers and sisters. So they give up that reproductive imperative in the immediate for some benefits in the future payoff. One, more genes on the gene pool because the babies help to grow, and their genes are from their brothers and sisters. But that doesn't occur anywhere. And some of the things that are noted where it does occur is limited food and more competition for food. Although you'll see there's other things like low quality of habitat. So there isn't enough nesting sites. So you might as well hang out here. And so when I die as your parents, then you can inherit my home range for you to utilize in the future. And there's some interesting research that was going on with Florida scrub jays in these communal groups. And now that there's fragmented and reduction in the overall habitat, how that's affecting the tightness of those social networks. One of the other things, as I mentioned, you have helpers at the nest, and then sometimes they don't have helpers at the nest, but it's weird for birds to help take care of their brothers and sisters. And sometimes it's not even closely related birds that are helping to raise that next brood. But you see it really commonly, not just within the scrub jays, but a number of corvid species. So I want to hit a few highlights. This was some things that I had the students do. So again, remember this was stolen from All About Birds, which is a wonderful resource, but it's some interesting things. And that's first starting with the Canada jay, because I think they're cute. I think they're friendly. And if you go up to the boreal forest, they come and visit you if you're trying to give them any kind of handout. You put your food, they'll come out. I was in northern Minnesota and I had some snacks because I was looking at a feeder for hoary redpolls and common redpolls, and it looked like redpolls to me, just searching and searching. So I put my little snacks up on the hood of the car, and I had Canada jays come down and steal all my potato chips because I was looking here and they were just having a fun time there and flew off with it. They are sometimes called friends of lumberjacks because they come and steal people in camp food, and lumberjacks historically had some problems with that. And they are part of First Nations mythologies, especially of the Algonquin people being this trickster that I mentioned before that pushes the limit of societal norms because it's coming into camp, it's coming into these native villages, stealing some things and then running off. This is also a big bird that's been talked about because of climatic change. They're very, very sensitive to warming temperatures because they cache food at the snow line. So they recognize where the snow line is, and they have a cool behavior where they lick their food and it sticks together. And they do it so it freezes in the winter. And so then they can come back and start breeding much earlier than other birds because they have all this stored flesh. And they're really good at picking up things at roadkill. They often visit hunters as they're butchering meat, and you also find them on carcasses. So they store these little bits of frozen meat around the environment and then can retrieve them. Clark's nutcrackers also breed really, really early. So I actually talked a lot longer than I thought I would. So I'll just try to hit a few different things like the pinyon jay, which is a little bit different than other corvids because they don't have those nasal bristles that you tend to see on a lot of other corvids. And they are following pine nuts, and they cache pine nuts just like the Clark's nutcracker do. They don't have as good as a memory, and they don't cast as much because they're constantly moving to ripening trees. So much like red crossbills and white ringed crossbills that are moving about to try to find the best food, the pinyon jays are doing the same. Green jays use tools, oftentimes little sticks to pry up bark to get to insects underneath of that. And they also have a lot of parental care. Let's pick some other things. Stellar jays are just cool. They didn't find anything that awesome about Stellar jays. Blue jays we know about. Florida scrub jay we talked about. California scrub jay. Oh, that's kind of interesting that they have like this oxpecker behavior where they go and have these relationships with deer, where they pick up ticks from deer. And also they give warning calls to the deer. So there was one study that was looking at like, I don't know, Zion National Park, some national park, where the deer, like fish, would go to certain areas where those scrub jays were to get ticks cleaned off of them. So fish go to them, they're called cleaning stations, where they open their mouth and little shrimps go in, little wrasses go in. But there was this feeding station associated with some scrub jays. The island scrub jay is a different sort of beast. It's isolated on the Channel Islands, and it doesn't have that same tight network. It doesn't have that cooperative care that you see in the other ones, which is kind of an interesting thing. And I haven't researched that why, but it's probably about resources, and they're not as spotty as they are on the mainland when there's more species competing for things. Magpies, besides following wolves, just like some ravens follow wolves, looking for carrion to be carried out. Also, magpies, when they're raised in captivity, sometimes collect objects to offer as nuptial gifts. And so this is where you get this legend of liking shiny things. But if you're raising them in captivity, they're going to pick up the shiny things because they're noticeable. But a lot of them also give gifts, just like cardinals give gifts, osprey give gifts to the female to induce mating. Oops, shrink. Made that too big. All right. And I think we'll end with the raven because I'm over by 7 minutes or so. So a lot of really interesting things I didn't talk about are symbiotic relationships with other birds and mammals, like with the wolves and following them around. But I think at the root of talking about corvids is all about their mental agility and their mental capacity. So hopefully I gave you some fun facts to think about for the evening and some things to look at your feeders, because you don't need to go to these exotic places and find where there are corvids. In fact, I think the last time the Hampton Roads Bird Club was up in Newport News Park, they found a raven. So occasionally we can even get them around our area and watch them and make some observations. So I thank you. And then the last thing I'll leave you with, because it always seems to be confusing, and I like this cartoon, is a little bit how do you tell ravens from crows. So if you happen to have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If not, happy Halloween early, and remember to be spooky in nature.
Let's see.
Any questions in the room? Any questions there in the Zoom?
Let's see. Well, she's got it.
Okay. No questions? So I either did that bad or I did that
No,
awesome.
lots of thank yous. and
A lot of thank you.
Love your presentation.
All right, awesome. Because you might not notice it, but I was really, really nervous and really self-conscious tonight. So
Really
Good.
interesting. Great talk.
Yeah,
It
we
was
enjoyed it.
wonderful.
good, good. I'm glad you're just making those up for me. I'll give you the money afterwards. I appreciate that. So thank you again for inviting me, and I had a wonderful evening.
Thank you. And thank you very
Oh,
much.
sweet. Now I can buy some food and hide it from myself.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
We enjoyed it very much.
Good.